So my presentation will show you the experience of the Publications Office of the European Union. We use e-archiving services since 2016, and you will have an idea with this presentation how a public administration can both benefit from e-archiving and contribute to it. Next slide, please. Can you move to the next slide?
You can control the slides yourself. Just above your slides, you'll see a plus,
yes,
an arrow.
okay.
Yes.
Sorry.
No problem.
Thank you. So there are three main points in my presentation. First, I'll explain you the context in which we deploy our activity of long-term preservation. I'll explain the mission of the Publications Office and its activities, and I'll explain also two peculiarities that have an impact on the way we archive things. Those are the publication workflow and the way we model the publications. Then, as a second point, I'll explain how the Publications Office uses the services of e-archiving, with an overview of which services we use and why, and with some information about the customizations we brought to the standard services. And finally, I'll conclude with the benefits we find in this situation. So, first point, a brief introduction to the Publications Office of the European Union. The Publications Office is an interinstitutional institution that is at the service of all the other EU institutions, bodies and agencies that are approximately more than 60. So the mission of the Publications Office is first to produce the publications authored by the EU institutions, to give access to these publications, whether they are produced or not by the Publications Office. So the Publications Office assigns identifiers and maintains websites to publish those text or material. The third mission is to facilitate the reuse of the information and the data sets that are published. And finally, the last mission is to preserve all those publications for the future generations. So how does the Publications Office implement this mission? You can see on the right side of the slide the various topics covered by the publications and the corresponding websites giving access to them. So for example, the websites EURLEX and EU Law in Force cover legal texts. EU tenders can be found on TED. General publications, that's our books, reports, brochures, maps, fact sheets, and so forth. They are on EU publications. Articles promoting results of research funded by the EU are accessible on Cordis, and the website Data Europa EU centralizes data sets produced by EU institutions, but also by public administrations of the member states. And finally, the Publications Office is also producer of information by publishing reference lists of codes and labels. So these resources are created for its own activity and are put on the website EU vocabularies for reuse by the public. And we also give an open access to the EU Web Archive. So we capture regularly the EU websites of all the EU institutions, and we give access to the result on this website. So how is the archive integrated in the Publications Office context? The first characteristic is the electronic publication workflow. So in a very simplified way, manuscripts or documents ready for publishing are sent to the office and always published before they are archived. So the files sent by the EU institutions are received and stored in the Digital Dissemination Repository, which is called CELAR. And then the CELAR feeds various websites, and then the archive, which in our case is called EUDOR, receives them once they have been made public. The second feature of our archival objects is the way they are modeled. As we preserve publications translated in many languages, we stick to a standard well known from librarians, which is the FRBR. So for us, one publication is the work, which has common metadata for all the linguistic versions. The level expression is devoted to the linguistic versions. So in this example, which is taken from an official journal, you see the 24 official languages of the EU. Then the level manifestation and item are dedicated to the various formats in each language version, in which each language version is available. So in this example, you have one HTML and one PDF for each language. On the right side, you see that the statistics of our EUDOR, our long-term preservation system, reflect this hierarchy in what it contains. So we preserve 2.5 million publications, for which there are 33 million language versions. And the total of content files, so without the metadata files, reach the number of 143 million. At the level of the formats we preserve, this pie shows that the two major formats we hold are the XML, so it's a structured format mainly used for the legal texts, and PDF, used for legal and non-legal documents. We have also a quite big amount of TIFF files that have been produced mainly during the digitization of our paper collections. So, after the summary of our long-term digital preservation activity at the Publications Office, let's see now how we use the eArchiving services. First of all, what do we use? So this slide shows a synopsis of the services offered by eArchiving. So in green are the elements used by the Publications Office. eArchiving services are based on main reference standards, and we use all of them. So OIS, the well-known reference model for an open archival information system that is widely used in the digital preservation community. We use also the METS, so the transmission standard for the exchange of packages with data and metadata. As we work with the specific ecosystem of the Publications Office, we use METS as transmission standard with our main producer, which is the CELA, so the repository that feeds the many important websites. And that is why we don't use the eArch SIP, the submission information package from the eArch specification. We use the METS instead. The last main reference standard we use is PREMIS, so the preservation metadata implementation strategies that we use for the preservation events that occur during the life of our digital objects. eArchiving promotes also some core specifications. So among them, the Publications Office applies the eArch AIP, so the Archival Information Package, for all its digital objects. As software, we use one of the open sources recommended by eArchiving, which is RODA. So all our ingestions, preservation actions, and the interface we use to consult our data use various components of RODA. We have a contract with the consortium to which Keep Solutions belong, Keep being the company that created RODA and who customizes RODA for our needs. And finally, among the communication services provided by eArchiving, we use mainly the trainings and the conference as this one. So I said that our policy is to use as much as possible the existing standards, but at the same time, I said also that the Publications Office has very specific needs, because we preserve mainly documents modeled with FRBR, and we publish usually in up to 24 languages, which is a quite rare need in the world. So that is why we needed to customize our workflow. So we'll develop some specific plugins in RODA for us. And I'll take some examples of them. So the first one is the ingest workflow. The incoming METS packages have to be translated into the eArch AIP structure, and this according to the FRBR hierarchy. So this mapping is performed by a specific plugin. A second example is the EU login. As EU institution, we need to comply to the security instructions valid for all internal applications. So that's why our RODA login has to follow it. A third example of plugin is the EUROVOC and reference table synchronization. As we publish in many languages, and as our notion of a publication covers all languages, the metadata we have in our data need to be common to all languages. And that is why we usually have a lot of codes in the metadata. So these codes refer to external reference tables that have the list of these codes plus the 24 translations in clear text. So in order us to view these metadata in RODA and in order to search in English on the interface and not on the codes, because it's quite complicated to have in his memory, the main codes are indexed in clear by RODA and when new AIPs are created. So this plugin maps the codes found in the metadata files with their label coming from the reference list or from EUROVOC. But it happens also that the publications office requests customization that can be useful to other users. So, for example, the module representation network that you can find in RODA has been in fact developed after an audit had been performed at the publications office. And one of the remarks was that the information, the representation information was missing. So it's an OIS notion. So RODA RODA integrated this in its software, and now this information is proposed free of use within RODA. So it's information about all the formats. You can find it in its GitHub. So now the benefits of using e-archiving. From our perspective, there are three main advantages. First, using open source software reduces the risk of vendor lock. So we are not stuck with software, and if needed, it remains always possible to migrate to another system without too complications. Second, using international or European standards increases our interoperability with our other archives or with users. And finally, it's important for us to be part of the e-archiving community of practice, because as a public administration, we spend public money. So it's important to use it correctly and to foster the reuse of our tools or our experience. So that's it for my part, and I'll be happy to answer your question when the question time arrives.